As the American 4th Armored Division led by Brigadier General Joseph Kachona approached the Ohrdruf Concentration Camp, the smell of death and decay lingered in the air. Liberating soldiers would later say how they smelt the camp before they saw it, and as they broke through the barbed wire fences and into the main site, there were corpses scattered everywhere. In one final ruthless and brutal act, the SS guards, as they left the camp, slaughtered around 30 prisoners. Even the most senior commanders of the Allied forces visited Ohrdruf, and they were horrified by what they saw, and the incredibly battle-hardened General Patton could not even enter some of the huts where the corpses were stacked high up. But because of the horror that was discovered, a number of American guards ruthlessly executed and killed a few SS guards that remained. The prisoners turned on them, but there was one female guard whose identity today remains unknown, who was brutalised and executed by the US forces and the prisoners. Today we look at this woman's story and her brutal final moments. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Ohrdruf Concentration Camp was only open for a matter of months, and it was a site where up to 20,000 people were held and locked up. They were forced to do very hard labour and were worked to death on a daily basis. The inmates were forced to work on huge projects linking a communication centre in the basement of the Mühlberg Castle to a planned railway project. One historian has even theorised that the prisoners could have been constructing a nuclear test zone inside a nearby mountain using tunnels that were dug by hand by the inmates. Work days for the prisoners was very long, up to 14 hours, and if a prisoner was too sick to work, then they were sent to other sites where they faced extermination and even worse conditions. The prisoners were not given sufficient clothing or food and sanitation, and there was also a complete lack of facilities. The guards were ruthless and brutal, and some were even sent from Auschwitz to bolster the ranks. There were plans at the site to even make an underground headquarters for Hitler and the Nazi Party's inner circle, should they have been evacuated from Berlin and then escaped. The prisoners had been kept terribly, and those who could not work were shipped to Bergen-Belsen, and it's believed that around 7,000 prisoners died at Ohrdruf. In the final days of the camp, the SS, Volkssturm and Hitler Youth evacuated most of the prisoners, who remained on death marches, and there were large executions on these marches. When the Americans arrived at Ohrdruf on the 4th of April 1945, they were horrified by what they saw, and it was the first concentration camp liberated by the Americans. As well as the execution of prisoners by the SS guards by the gates, there were corpses scattered absolutely everywhere. The soldiers of the 4th Armoured Division and the 89th Infantry Division were horrified and found many more corpses, some partially burned on pyres to conceal the crimes, and even Generals Eisenhower, Bradley and Patton arrived at the camp days later to see what was happening. Eisenhower wrote of Ohrdruf that, "The most interesting, although horrible sight that I encountered during the trip was a visit to a German internment camp near Gotha. The things I saw beg a description. While I was touring the camp I encountered 3 men who had been inmates, and by one route or another had made their escape. I interviewed them for an interpreter. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty and bestiality was so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room they were piled up, 20 or 30 naked men killed by starvation. George Patton would not even enter. He said he would get sick if he did so." General Patton also wrote about what he found and what he saw, and he documented, "In a shed was a pile of around 40 completely naked human bodies in the last stages of emaciation. These bodies were lightly sprinkled with lime, not for the purpose of destroying them, but for the purpose of removing the stench. When the shed was full, I presume its capacity to be about 200, the bodies were then taken to a pit a mile from the camp where they were buried. The inmates claimed that around 3,000 men, who had been either shot in the head or who had died from starvation, had been so buried since the 1st of January. When we began to approach with our troops, the Germans thought it expedient to remove the evidence of their crime. Therefore they had some of the slaves exhume the bodies and place them on a mammoth griddle, composed of 60-centimetre railway tracks laid on brick foundation. They poured pitch onto the bodies and then built a fire of pine wood and coal underneath them. They were not very successful in their operation, because there was a pile of human bones, skulls, charred torsos, on or under the griddle, which must have accounted for many hundreds. There was a lot of anger amongst the liberating soldiers and the prisoners who were found inside of Ohrdruf, and they wanted to enact some form of vengeance upon the guards of the camp. There were some SS guards who had remained, and these were captured by the Americans, and they were mostly captured wearing civilian clothes or prisoner clothes. This was assumed because they attempted to blend in with those few inmates who remained, but they were very quickly turned over to the authorities. There were some American photographers who captured the aftermath of how the SS guards of Ohrdruf who remained there were treated. There were some captured, and they were often brutalised and battered, and 2 in particular had their faces turned purple with the beatings that they received. These 2 guards in particular also had their bodies littered with bullets. One received at least 7 bullets, all fired into his chest near to the heart, presumably by an American guard with his rifle or machine gun. There were also a number of guards who were set upon like this. Another man was battered and stoned to death by Soviet prisoners, and the American liberators presumably turned their backs upon the beating, seeing it as warranted because of the horror they encountered. But there was a female concentration camp guard who worked at Ohrdruf in the final days and who remained, and she was photographed in the liberation of the camp, lying on the floor, having been a victim of the reprisal killing. Of course, the fate of this woman is very controversial, as if she had surrendered to the Americans, then she would have technically been a prisoner of war, but what is certain is that the final minutes of her life that she experienced would have been a harrowing ordeal. Obviously we can't show the images of this woman, we'll just have to describe them. This woman, a female guard, was wearing what appeared to be civilian clothes. However, she was wearing dark trousers and a dark jacket, as well as a shirt and jumper underneath. It does appear that she was wearing boots, indicating that she was a guard, as normal prisoners would not have access to this form of clothing. Of course, the boots would have earmarked her as quite obviously a female concentration camp guard, amongst others. She was also wearing a belt which was considered a luxury item of the camp to hold her trousers up, but the injuries this female guard sustained were rather harrowing. She was photographed lying on her back on the muddy ground, close to a small ditch, and she had very muddy trousers, indicating that she was probably dragged to the place where she was executed by inmates. She suffered severe injuries to her face and had many bruises and cuts to it, including a rather severe cut to her neck. Her black hair was blood-stained, and she had also sustained cuts to her stomach. But what is also certain is that there is at least 1 bullet wound in this woman's body. There is a bullet wound found in her stomach near to her side, and there were probably other bullet wounds too. Around this woman's body are also a number of stones presumably thrown at her corpse, and these could have also been used in her slaughter. It is certain that the US guards that liberated Ohrdruf would have fired at this woman, as they were the only ones who had access to firearms and weapons in the camp. The prisoners of Ohrdruf certainly did not have these, and the bullet wound found on the female concentration camp guard is almost identical to the wounds found on the other SS guards who were killed and photographed around Ohrdruf. Whether she was put out of her misery as she was turned upon by the prisoners, or whether the American soldiers had an active part in her execution and slaughter, it is not known. Presumably though, a gunshot to the stomach is not fatal always. But this woman suffered a brutal death, and she is one of the only female guards of the concentration camps of World War II who was executed in almost instant reprisal. She did not go to a war crimes tribunal, but her death was handed out due to the horrors of the camp. The prisoners did not want her being handed to the Americans, so probably carried out their instant vengeance, knowing that the US forces would probably do little about it. The female guard of Ohrdruf was amongst a number of others who were executed in reprisal that day. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.